For nearly 4 decades, Richard Carpenter carried a version of the truth that the public never fully heard. Not because he wanted to hide it, but because the world he and his sister Karen lived in during the 1970s didn't have the words for what was actually happening to her. Now, in his late 70s, Richard has spent recent years speaking more openly than ever about what really unfolded behind the Carpenters' polished harmonies and chart-topping success. And the picture he paints is far more painful than the rumors ever suggested. Karen Carpenter was born on March 2nd, 1950, in New Haven, Connecticut, the younger of 2 children in a household where music played constantly and expectations ran high. Her brother Richard, 4 years older, showed early and obvious musical gifts on piano, and by most accounts of the family's dynamic, he became the center of gravity around which the household organized itself. Karen grew up in that orbit, present, watching, absorbing the records that fill the house, but not positioned as the one who mattered most. Many who have written about the family, including biographer Ray Coleman and journalist Randy Schmidt, have described a home life shaped heavily around Richard's promise, with their mother Agnes especially invested in his success. In 1963, when Karen was 13, the family relocated from Connecticut to Downey, California, a move driven largely by the desire to put Richard closer to the music industry's center of gravity. Karen didn't choose that upheaval. She simply lived through it, the way she seems to have lived through many decisions made around her rather than with her. It was in Downey, almost by accident, that Karen found the one thing that would become entirely her own: the drums. She joined her high school band to avoid gym class, disliked the glockenspiel she was first handed, and then saw another student playing drums. Something in her changed immediately. Her parents bought her a Ludwig kit, and she practiced with an intensity that impressed the professional musicians around her. Within a year, she was tackling rhythms that took most students far longer to master, and those who taught her often marveled at her natural instinct for time and groove. By 1965, 15-year-old Karen was the drummer in the Richard Carpenter Trio, an unusual instrumental group that, against long odds, won a Hollywood Bowl Battle of the Bands competition and briefly landed a contract with RCA. That deal fizzled when the label shelved their recordings, but Karen's reputation as a serious drummer only grew, and she later received a prestigious award recognizing her playing. Behind a drum kit, she had found a role that felt like hers alone, a place where she didn't need to perform emotionally, just musically. That changed when Herb Alpert signed Karen and Richard to A&M Records in 1969. Success arrived fast. Their second album produced, They Long to Be Close to You, and the Carpenters became one of the defining acts of the decade almost overnight. But there was a problem the industry saw as purely practical. Audiences and venues couldn't see Karen clearly behind a full drum kit. The label solution was to move her out front as a standing vocalist and bring in a touring drummer, Cubby O'Brien, to handle percussion. It was framed at the time as a simple staging adjustment. In hindsight, it removed Karen from the one space where she had felt anchored and put her, instead, in the position she seems to have found hardest, standing alone, visible from every angle, expected to be flawless. It was around this same period, in 1967, that Karen began dieting in earnest, according to accounts compiled in Carpenters, The Musical Legacy, the 2021 book written with Richard's direct involvement. The pressure only intensified as the group's fame grew. Grueling tour schedules, often back-to-back one-night shows with no dedicated management to protect their health, became normal. Richard has since said plainly that many of those tours were unnecessary and that the lack of a manager left both of them overextended. He has also been candid that the band's audience wanted a specific look and sound, and that scrutiny of Karen's body became part of the machinery around her, even if no one framed it that way out loud at the time. By the mid-1970s, Karen's weight loss had become impossible to ignore. Photographers captured a woman who looked increasingly fragile with each tour. The band canceled their 1975 tour because of her declining health, and she was hospitalized that year, reportedly weighing under 100 pounds. Yet anorexia nervosa was barely understood by doctors, let alone by a pop band's inner circle in the mid-1970s. Karen herself resisted the label for years. In a well-known 1981 British television interview, when asked directly whether she had the Slimmer's disease, she brushed off the question by saying she was simply tired. Even those closest to her struggled to name what they were watching. Songwriter John Bettis, who worked with the Carpenters for years, later said that no one even knew how to pronounce anorexia nervosa until well into 1980, and that everyone around Karen assumed the fix was as simple as encouraging her to eat more. Richard has also been open about the fact that he was not in a position to be Karen's primary support during much of this period, because he was fighting his own crisis. In the late 1970s, he developed a dependency on prescription sleeping pills, skipping meals, and losing so much weight himself that he dropped to a gaunt 140 pounds despite standing 6 feet tall. He has described losing his motivation almost entirely during that stretch, and in 1979 he entered treatment and got sober. It's a detail that reframes the family narrative in an important way. While Karen was quietly disappearing in front of the world, her brother, the person closest to her professionally, was also unraveling, just less visibly. In 1981, according to accounts Richard has since confirmed, Karen finally admitted to him that her relationship with food had become a serious problem and that she needed help. She reached out to Cherry Boone, a fellow performer who had recovered from an eating disorder, and through that connection began treatment with therapist Stephen Levincron in New York. She hoped for a fast resolution, given her performing schedule, but was told real recovery could take years. Richard has said he still feels frustration, even decades later, about how poorly the medical system served her, pointing specifically to a widely respected specialist who treated her in 1982, but, in his words, did nothing to actually help her condition improve. Karen was eventually hospitalized at Lenox Hill Hospital in New York, where a feeding tube inserted to help her regain strength accidentally punctured one of her lungs, a complication that set her recovery back further. By late 1982, Karen appeared to be stabilizing. She had gained weight, seemed more like herself in photographs, and was pictured smiling among fellow music legends at that year's Grammy Awards. Just 24 days after that photograph was taken, on February 4, 1983, Karen died of heart failure in her parents' Downey home. The cause was later tied to the physical toll of prolonged anorexia, compounded by damage from ipecac syrup, a substance she had reportedly been using to induce vomiting, which is toxic to heart muscle with repeated use. She was 32 years old. In the years immediately following her death, Richard rarely discussed the specifics publicly. Interviews tended to circle back to the music, the arrangements, the hits, the legacy, rather than the illness itself. That reticence has visibly shifted as Richard has aged. In interviews tied to the 2021 book Carpenters, the musical legacy, and in conversations since, he has spoken with a directness that wasn't present in earlier decades. He has confirmed that Karen's anorexia was more severe and lasted longer than most fans ever grasped in real time. He has acknowledged that the family and the people around Karen genuinely did not understand what they were facing, not because they didn't care, but because almost no framework existed yet for recognizing or treating the disease. He has pointed to the unrelenting schedule, the visual scrutiny that came with fronting a hit act, and the absence of anyone whose job it was to protect the siblings from overwork. What comes through most clearly in Richard's later reflections isn't blame directed at any single person, not their mother, not the label, not even Karen herself, but a kind of accumulated grief over how many separate failures lined up at once. He has spoken about missing the recordings Karen never got to make, saying he's certain she would have kept performing and recording well into old age had she lived. He has also acknowledged his own blind spots during those years, admitting that his focus on production and arrangements meant he didn't fully register how much his sister was struggling until it was nearly too late. Karen Carpenter's death became a turning point for public awareness of eating disorders, a condition that had barely registered in mainstream medicine or media before 1983. Her family later established a foundation in her name to fund research into anorexia and related illnesses, and her story is still cited today in conversations about the disorder's history. For Richard, now well into his 70s, revisiting that period publicly seems less about correcting old rumors and more about making sure his sister is remembered as a full person, an extraordinary drummer, a singer with a voice historians still rank among the greatest of her generation, and someone who was let down by an industry and an era that simply didn't know how to help her in time. Karen's death also reshaped how the public understood the entertainment industry's role in the illnesses of the people it puts on stage. In the immediate aftermath, medical experts and journalists pointed to her case as a wake-up call, and hospitals and researchers began treating anorexia nervosa as a legitimate, potentially fatal condition rather than a phase tied to vanity. Before 1983, the disorder had almost no name recognition outside specialist medical circles. Karen's very public decline, followed by her sudden death, changed that almost overnight, even though the change came too late to help her. The years since have produced a steady stream of attempts to tell Karen's story more fully, some of which Richard has supported and some of which he has actively opposed. In 1987, filmmaker Todd Haynes released a short experimental film that reenacted Karen's life using modified Barbie dolls, using the format to comment on the pressures placed on her body and image. Richard was unhappy with the portrayal and, along with the Carpenter estate, successfully pursued a copyright claim over the unlicensed use of the Carpenters' music, leading the film to be pulled from circulation in 1990. 2 years later, a more conventional made-for-television film aired on CBS, with an actress lip-syncing to Karen's actual recordings. Richard has generally been more supportive of projects that center the music and involve his direct input, including 2 documentaries he helped produce in 1997 and 2007, and the 2021 book that prompted many of his most candid recent comments. Institutions have also worked to preserve Karen's legacy in ways that go beyond film and print. In 1994, California State University, Long Beach, where both Karen and Richard had studied, opened a performing arts center named for the siblings, funded in part by their donations. The Carpenter family also established a foundation in Karen's name that has funded research into anorexia nervosa and other eating disorders, turning her death into a source of ongoing medical progress rather than only a private tragedy. Decades later, music critics and historians continue to single out Karen's voice specifically. In 2010, Rolling Stone included her among its list of the 100 greatest singers in popular music history, a recognition that arrived long after her death, but confirmed what fans had always felt watching her perform. For Richard, now approaching 80, the act of talking about all of this so plainly seems to serve a purpose beyond nostalgia. He has said, in various interviews tied to recent projects, that he still keeps a photograph from that final Grammy gathering.